So to derive the expression of the variational autoencoder or the conditional variational autoencoder, we start with the scale divergence between the approximating distribution Q phi and the true posterior distribution P of Zx. And we develop the terms here. So essentially, we start with a definition that we've seen just right before, and we can, using Bayes' rule, we can expand this term, we can invert it, better said, like P theta of Z condition on X, we can revert it and could write it as P of X condition on Z times the probability of Z and divided by the probability of X. That will end up at the top of the numerator. And then using the properties of the logarithm, remember that logarithm of a product can be turned into a sum. And then basically like this P of theta of X will come up as a sum, which will multiply this Q phi of Zx. And we will have integral of this quantity times P of X, which does not depend on Z. P of X can move outside of the integral. And then this integral of Q of Z condition on X over Z should sum up to 1. So you have this term here that does not depend on Z anymore. And then we have another term, which is essentially taking this Q phi of Z condition on X times the logarithm of QZ condition on X divided by P of theta of Z. And then we have the additional term, which is again this term here, Q of Z condition on X, multiplying this this P of X divided of P of X condition on Z. But this term here, instead of having it in the denominator, we can have it as a negative, right? So because this is like using the properties of the logarithm. So we have these three terms here. So now the first term is basically the marginal log likelihood. The second term is the KL divergence. Notice that this is exactly the same expression as before, right? But we have changed some terms. So here in the denominator, we don't have P of Z condition on X, but we have P of Z. So now this means that this is the KL divergence between the approximating distribution Z condition on X and this distribution, this marginal over the latent variable Z. So we have the KL divergence of Q of Z condition on X and P of Z. And then here we have this minus, and notice this is an integral, and we have this term here multiplying this quantity here. So essentially we are integrating and weighting every contribution of log of P of theta by this posterior distribution here. So essentially this is the same as computing the expectation, sampling from this distribution Z condition on X, the expectation of what? Of this quantity over here, right? That's basically from the definition. So we have these three terms here now. And like moving things, like if you look at this and you move this term on this side and then you move these other terms on the other side, you end up with an expression that looks like this. We have here the log probability of X. This is the marginal of the observations. That's a quantity that we want to maximize with respect to the model parameters theta. And then we have minus this KL divergence between this this approximating distribution Q of Z condition on X and the true posterior Z condition on X. And we want to minimize this quantity because we want this approximation Q to be close to P, right? And so this will be equal to this expectation of log of P of X condition on Z minus the KL divergence now from the posterior, approximating this posterior and this marginal over the latent variable Z. And so essentially what we can now say, because the KL divergence is always positive, we can derive like what is called the evidence lower bound, we can say that the likelihood of the observations, or the log likelihood, should be bigger, because this term is bigger or equal than 0. This should be bigger than this term over here, which is this expectation of log of P of X condition on Z minus the KL divergence. Now, there's many interpretations of this, but one way of interpreting this is that now basically like we are, or let's see this in the next slide. Maybe this will be more clear. So, so this term, right? So in the variational autoencoder, this term is basically what is like the encoder. So basically, like now we are. We start with the observations X, and with an encoder, we land on those regions of the parameters of parameter space Z, which are likely to have produced this observations X. That's why it's called an autoencoder or variation autoencoder, because like X gets mapped to one latent variable, to one distribution over Z, and then from this distribution we sample and we decode, right, to produce the observations X. So we have here, this is the encoder and this is the decoder, right, which measures the likelihood of the observations conditioned on this sampled Z variable. And this is like an interesting interpretation, because now like to basically find the Zs that are likely to have cost X, we're using an encoder. So we're going directly to the regions that are likely to have produced this X. If we had to search over all possible Zs that have produced X, this would be like more difficult and computationally more expensive. So, so that's one interpretation. So basically encoding is inference. Given a sample X, we derive the inference posterior and draw a latent variable Z. And decoding is like the generation process where, given a latent variable Z, we generate a sample X prime. And maximizing this term is equivalent to minimizing the difference between X and this sampled decoded X prime sample. So this term is used for data reconstruction, and in practice in many computer vision and in virtual humans applications, we use the L1 or L2 distance between these generated samples and the observations that we have. So basically, the inference posterior has a known form with unknown parameters. And the latent prior can be either predefined or learned from data. And when both of the terms are Gaussian, the KLD term has a closed form expression. And when this term is 0, we say that the inference posterior is independent of X. So when this term is 0, notice that this is comparing the distribution of Z condition on X with this latent prior. So when this is 0, it means, because this does not depend on X, it means that our inference posterior does not depend on X. And when this happens, we say that we have a collapse, because we are not leveraging the evidence of, we're not leveraging X to map to Z, right? So this is typically a degenerate case. All right, so we maximize this, this lower bound to train the variational autoencoder via backpropagation. However, we said that the variational autoencoder requires going from X to Z posterior and then basically sampling from this posterior. Now, and the parameters that we want to backpropagate through are these networks. And these networks are, you have a network, let's go back, like maybe to understand this better. Like these Q phi and P theta are parameterized with neural networks. And so we want to find those neural network parameters phi and the neural network parameters theta in order to basically maximize this lower bound. And the problem is that we said that we are mapping X to Z, or to the posterior, sorry, and then sampling. but then sampling operation is non-differentiable. So how are we going to solve this problem? So we're going from X, encoding it into a distribution, sampling Z, and decoding it to obtain X prime. But, you know, if we want to make X prime to be close to X, for example, like minimize X minus X prime, we need the derivative of X prime with respect to phi. But this means the derivative of X prime with respect to Z times the derivative of Z with respect to phi, which parameterizes the encoder here. But how do we know this derivative? Because Z has been sampled from a distribution. Well, there's something that is called the reparameterization trick, which is actually the thing that I like the most about this paper, which basically allows you to take derivatives through this sampling process. So how this is done is in a very smart way. So if we assume a Gaussian distribution for this P of Z condition on X, we can actually have an encoder that will predict, instead of predicting the sample directly, sorry about this, it's quite annoying. Instead of predicting the sample directly, it will predict the mean and the variance or the covariance of this distribution. And so this mean and variance will be parameterized with this neural network, which is the encoder phi. And it will be also a function of the input X as well. And now, given this, like the sufficient statistics of the distribution, mu and sigma, we can sample, right, Z by sampling like from this normal distribution with zero mean and unit variance, and then we can basically obtain a sample by shifting the mean to mu and scaling the variable by sigma, so that we have the desired mean and variance. And now we can decode to obtain X prime. So why are we doing this? And here's the nice property. So now we can compute this derivative of Z with respect to phi parameters, because all we need to do is to compute the derivative of mu of this sample, right, which is mu plus sigma times epsilon, epsilon being this sample from the normal distribution with zero mean and unit variance. And so when we can basically take this, compute these derivatives easily, so we have achieved what we wanted, which is differentiate through this sampling operation process, which is quite nice, simple, and very useful. Yeah. All right. So sometimes we're also interested in conditioning these variation autoencoders on some additional data. So conditional variable here C, so we can basically condition both the encoder and the decoder. Many times, like we only condition the decoder, but yeah, I mean, then you have like similar derivations for this conditional variational autoencoder. And that's exactly how this, using one of these variational autoencoders, is how you basically can predict, like given the observation, in this case the mesh, like different possible solutions for the contacts and the object contacts. And by sampling, like what I've shown before, by sampling different, once you've trained, so I forgot to mention something, once you've trained the encoder and decoder, like what you can do at test time is basically sample from this distribution and decode and produce different solutions, or you can just use the encoder if you have the observations. And basically using this, you can sample different solutions for the contacts and the potential object contacts. So basically these are the sampled contacts using this conditional variational autoencoder, which basically it says that for this pose, it's likely that these are in contact, and it basically tells you here with these labels which object is most likely to be in contact. In this case, like the feet are most of the times like in contact with the floor, as one would expect, and then you have here most likely to be chair, but you have also like, you know, other potential contacts, like in this case, like this is likely to be the bed, and so on. So this is basically like a way to condition on the scene, which basically is very human-centric. It looks mostly at the mesh of the human. So then, like, once you have these predicted contacts and potential objects, you can basically minimize an objective function, which has 3 terms, which is like an affordance term, a penetration term, and a regularization term. Perhaps the most interesting one is the affordance term, which basically says that for those vertices that are in contacts, FC, we want to minimize this FD distance. So these are basically these tensors that tell you for every vertex, like whether they are in contact and which object is likely to be in contact. Right, we have this penetration term. We've seen this before, where we minimize the distances when we have detected penetration. This means that the distance is smaller than 0 if we have this sign distance field for the scene. And we also have like some typical regularization where the pose should be close to the initialization. And using this, basically, you can generate static humans in scenes. Okay, but what about dynamic poses? What about generating human motion condition on the scene? This is a much, much harder problem because it requires to do some sort of planning and thinking about goals and like which things the human wants to contact and so on. So one of the first papers that produced like really compelling results was this paper called Phased Function Neural Networks. This was a SIGGRAPH 17 paper, and basically given 3D terrain and a type of motion, basically they synthesize a sequence of 3D poses. As you can see here, the human is, like the virtual human is adapting to the terrain, and so the pose is adapting to this different terrain. So how is this done? So there's 3 main challenges. So one is, how do we obtain the data to train such a model? It's not easy to capture people interacting with uneven terrains. And how do we encode the motion and the terrain together? And finally, how do we perform inference? So regarding the first challenge, so capturing data with varying terrain is very hard. But what we can do is, and this is what is done in this paper, is to record a subject walking and climbing stairs, right? And walking up a chair and down a chair and so on. And then like we have the human motion data. And what we can do is then to fit a terrain to the feet of the character in order to have these pairs of humans and terrain. So this is one way of doing data augmentation to obtain the data that we're interested, right? So oftentimes you don't have exactly the data that you want, so you have to be creative, and this is one way. So how you fit the terrains is using, if I remember correctly, like using surface patches, which are parameterized with splines, and then you optimize the parameters of the spline to fit the feet of the virtual human. We've seen like this in lecture 3, how to parameterize like local patches of surfaces with this spline-like surfaces. Oh, so let me play the video here. So this is the originally captured data, and notice that this data is captured without the terrain, and so you see the human like going up and down stairs. And so then this is how then like these different terrains are fitted into the human. Now, how to encode the motion and the terrain? So there's many ways of doing this. Basically, what is like relatively common is to encode as input the joint locations as positions, the joint velocities, and to also encode the route trajectory, because the route trajectory is very important for animation, and basically also the route velocity. And now the interesting part is how to encode the terrain. And so this is basically done by sampling with, these are these dots here that you can see along the trajectory. So basically you sample along these fixed dots, and then you measure the height of these dots. So this is basically given to the autoregressive system. And based on these height scalars sampled around a human trajectory, we will predict these future joints, the future velocities, and the future root trajectory and root velocity. You might wonder, what is this phase here? And we will get into this next. So the phase is an auxiliary variable that cycles between 0 and 2 pi. And it represents the progress of one's walking cycle. So 0 could be a foot lift off, and 2 pi is when we again land the foot. So without the phase, what happens is that the neural network tends to produce overly smooth results because it averages poses that are not synchronized in time. And so the motion looks stiff and has foot sliding artifacts. And so here, I believe there's a comparison between these two. Like this is without using the phased neural network. And let me see if this is displayed. Right. So you see that there's, if we don't use this phase function neural network, we'll have like foot sliding, which is resolved then if we use this phase. I don't have time to go exactly into the details, but then how this is done is like there's a phase that parameterizes like a neural network, and then basically it's basically like a variable that controls all the weights of a neural network. And then basically like you could think of it as like for every different phase, I have a different neural network that makes different predictions, and everything is tied together with this global variable. All right, so, and then like if using these techniques, you can synthesize these animations that look quite compelling. So this was definitely a paper that I found it was quite impressive at the time, like what it could achieve. Although it's a pretty simple model because it just uses this trajectory, right? And then the sampling points in front and the back. And still I can produce like a model that is reactive to the 3D scene. So this is quite interesting. I think what I also like about this is that it really is based on local geometry. And I think that's what makes it generalize quite nicely to different terrains and different environments, right? Because it's very local, right? It doesn't reason about what are stairs and what can different types of stairs. It only reasons about how high they are relative to the character. And I think that makes a lot of sense when we think about affordances and how we approach and how we interact with environment. I think in some way, my intuition is that there's that's how humans achieve like this high level of generalization. All right. So this concludes this lecture. Or this part of the lecture, we have like that current models, like the simple model, cannot model humans as a function of the scene. To synthesize humans in a static scene, we do need to think about contacts, or it's really useful to think about contacts. And contacts encode which body point touches which scene point. And one way to generate contacts is using these variational autoencoders. There's others, of course, but that's one solution. And then we have like that motion synthesis can be modeled with this autoregressive system, which predicts based on past joint trajectories and like some information about the environment, about the terrain. It can predict the future, and you can recurrently use this network to predict the future. All right, this is the end of this part. And in the next lecture, we will see more sophisticated models to synthesize human motion in the scene. In scenes that are also dynamic, I should add. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture.